It says that we are live. I'll just check it on our YouTube channel. Perfect. I think we are live.
Fantastic.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Karwan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. I'm Ishan Sharma, joining from Kanpur to present another Karwan special lecture for you on our YouTube channel. So if you're new to Karwan's YouTube channel, please subscribe so that you won't miss any updates on our upcoming sessions. And there are quite a few that are upcoming with scholars, with filmmakers, with artists, and so on and so forth. So do subscribe to get all the updates on your phone, and do click the bell icon also so that YouTube will send you notifications whenever we go live next. Today we are going to talk about Delhi, the making of colonial Delhi, urban planning and policy failure in the late 19th century city. Uh, Delhi is my favorite city. Being a Kanpur wala, I think they won't accept me now, but that's that. And to talk about Delhi, I have a very special guest, Dr. Raghav Kishore, who is a historian of modern South Asia, and his research has primarily focused on the transformation of urban governance under colonial rule and in the 19th and 20th century. And his first book, Ungovernable City, Productive Failures in the Making of Colonial Delhi, 1858 to 1911, talks about, you know, uh, the production of urban spaces and its relation to colonial governance in Delhi in the aftermath of the Great Rebellion of 1857 until the transfer of the capital in 1911. It suggests that it was in this period that new modes for governance came to reshape the city, especially politically, culturally, and in various aspects of it. So, demonstrating how conflicting agendas of urban policy could stifle specific state initiatives, he argues that such misadventures or failures should be seen as productive. On the one hand, by providing a language of new legal codes for the population with which to assail the stage, and on the other, by enlarging the latter's bureaucracy and regulatory capabilities. So I won't take more time. He's also working on a second project that builds on his postdoctoral research that he conducted at the University of York between 2016 to 2017. And maybe he can talk a little about that also. That talks about WHO and FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization of UN, and how they shaped India, or India shaped the formation of these two organizations from 1946 to 1967. So, without further ado, thank you so much, Dr. Kishore, for accepting my invitation. Thank you so much for being here. And I won't take much time. You can start the conversation and you can start sharing the screen also.
Great. Thanks, Ishan. Thank you. As I said, thank you to you and the team for having me today. It's great work that you guys are doing. So I'm really happy to be a part of it. And it's a great pleasure to speak to everyone. Okay, so I'm going to Ishan, I'm just going to share my screen so that you get the PowerPoint. And then I'll just, just bear with me. So I think you can see the PowerPoint. Is that visible?
Yes, it is.
Great. Okay. So, yes. So I'm going to talk to everybody. I think my talk is about an hour, and I know that there's time for questions, so it'd be nice to hear from everybody. My work, as Ishan mentioned, is my book. My book project was on the reconstruction of Delhi after 1857 and the growth of the bureaucracy in the city. So, my book came out in 2020, and it deals with this period between 1857 and 1911, and it examines the relationship between policy failures and the growth of the state. And the argument that I make in the book is just that, is that there is a relationship there, and that policy failures were able to create opportunities for the local government and the growth of the state in Delhi. And I use several examples in the book try and draw this out. Um, Today, I want to do that by focusing on one of the chapters in the book, actually, and on the Delhi Municipal Committee, the DMC, Delhi Municipal Committee, or the Delhi Municipality, which was formed in 1863. I mean, you can see, I'm going to put a little postcard here. I think you can see that the town hall building, which still exists today, I think it's going to become a hotel soon, last I heard, is on the right. And there was a clock tower, which was built by the municipality, demolished in the 1960s. But I didn't have a representative figure of the DMC's logo, so in place of that, this is standing in place. So I'm going to talk about the main civic agency in the city, the DMC, which was the Delhi Municipal Committee, which was formed in 1863, and its efforts to regulate what were known as public spaces, what became public spaces from encroachments in the post-1857 period. I'll talk about the growth of its administrative structure and the implementation of infrastructure projects like drainage schemes and water supply. So I'm approaching the city from in this talk, and also generally from all the drains and the water and the encroachments angle. So I'm going to talk about that. You all are, many of you, might be from Delhi or know about the current avatar of the municipality, the MCD, and in one part of Delhi it's the NDMC. The MCD you're probably familiar with, and you're also familiar with the kind of issues that the MCD, for example, has been embroiled in recently. There's been, some of you might remember, a few years ago, there were disputes which are still continuing over the payment, non-payment rather, of the salaries of the sweepers and other employees. And there was a huge problem with this disposal of sanitary waste because these people went on strike for a long time, sanitary workers. So this was there in 2017, and I've just posted a little clipping from the Hindustan Times, a representative of that event, and also recently there were issues with the municipality, the municipal corporation. What I want to do in this talk is to try and help contextualize some of these events, and also think about some of the historical patterns that we can identify, and also the legacies of colonialism and how they impact, let's say, the work of the municipal corporation in this day and age, right? So maybe we can make some parallels there. That's what I'd like to do with this talk. But I want to also start by giving some backdrop into how I came to this project on the post-rebellion period, and the broader kind of academic field of urban history as it was when I did this project. So as I mentioned, it's a historiography blitz because I just want to really quickly go through my. So in the post-rebellion period, 1911 rather, Delhi was actually integrated into the Punjab for administrative purposes, but it was also an act of punishment. So it wasn't the capital city anymore. It lost out, so it lost its status as capital city as punishment for its participation in the rebellion, and the status as a provincial town in the Punjab. This remained until 1911. Provincial town in the Punjab. And it remained so till 1911 when the capital from Calcutta was shifted back of British India was shifted back to Delhi. So what drew me to this particular period was, I think, I'd seen, I want to say lacuna, but I think it's too strong a word. There was perhaps a slight lacuna on history. You had a lot of studies on 1857, Ghalib's Delhi, the early period. You had the last Mughal kind of studies on the early 19th century, and then you had a lot of work on post 1911, particularly then on partition and its aftermath, and of course you had longer durée studies like Professor Nayani Gupta's work, which and I used some of the themes that she's developed in her own work for this particular period, and I explored them in a bit more depth. I was actually intrigued at what it meant for Delhi at this time to become a provincial town. And that's kind of my interest in this period. And what I show in the book is that what does it mean to be a provincial town? A provincial town is that Delhi becomes a sort, particularly from what I found, is a laboratory for planning, for the intensive experimentation of municipal norms and planning, the development of environmental schemes, and like I said, it's a period of intense experimentation in the city, particularly with regard to planning and the development of schemes, environmental and so on, regulation of urban spaces, development of municipal codes. And so this is the way I thought of the city as a provincial town. And so I was looking at it from this perspective, and obviously I had to think about the larger, the canvas, the broader canvas in which of urban history, which when I was writing this book and prior to that when I wrote my thesis, I was thinking of. So there was excellent work coming out on Bombay, Calcutta, Delhi, and at the time when I wrote this, a lot of historians, urban historians, were beginning to question this assumption that the colonial government, the colonial state, was monolithic, that it, in other words, they were questioning this idea that it wasn't the all-powerful, all-seeing behemoth that could shape the urban landscape at its will, right? So this was a reaction to studies that had come out prior, which were looking at the way the colonial government could mold the urban fabric in places like Awadh and so on in North India and others. And there was an argument they were making is that Bombay, Prashant Kidambi was working on Delhi after 1911. Stephen Legge was working on Calcutta. There was, Swatik Chattopadhyay and others are working on. So there were people coming out and talking about the fact that urban plans and urban planning, for example, the argument they're making is that many of the plans that were laid out were failures. They were only partially complete. They weren't, so the state wasn't this whole scene, as I mentioned, behemoth. Why? Because not enough money was spent on these plans that looked great on paper, but they weren't really realized. There was in response, if they were created, they were based on racialized logics, and obviously that generated a lot of hostility and resentment, resistance, and ultimately overall they were arguing that their planning was a failure. So what I was seeing in Delhi, that there was a preponderance of planning activity and plans. The question was that I was thinking, how does one square that with the historiography that suggests that planning, full of failures and so on. And that's what I mentioned to you at the beginning, that I found a link between the two, that planning or policy failures, which I kind of pulled out from that, were actually quite productive for the state, even if plans themselves weren't efficacious. In other words, plans did not always set out to do what, their intentions were quite different from the outcomes, obviously. But what it did in terms of in this failure was that they were able to there was a longevity of the state that they contributed to, the failure of these plans. And so failure then became not the end point of my analysis, but the starting point, right? And I began to see it as a process, a productive process. So what I want to do now is, in the case of the DMC, which I will take up now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show that municipal plans, the DMC, as I said, was one of the major vehicles for urban renewal in the city at this particular point of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to argue that municipal intentions and plans were constantly subverted, right? Many of it was because of the complexity of its operations. It had experts the recommendations of the experts stifled its own plans. And of course, this generated local resistance. So there were contradictions, both internal and external resistance. But I'm going to suggest that this actually went hand in hand with the centralization of authority, bureaucratic enlargement, and the creation of a huge range of bylaws, municipal bylaws, which it gained in the process of this. So I'm going to take three, I started off by mentioning this, that I'm going to take three kind of examples to talk about the municipalities, MCs, or DMC, I should have said DMC, but the DMC's activities in this time, so three case studies I'm going to take is the policing of what became encroachments, and I kind of put encroachments in inverted commas, and I'll talk about that in just a second. The second issue that I'm going to talk about is the development of its administrative structure. And the third thing I'm going to talk about is infrastructure projects, drainage and water supplies, I started off saying. So it's going to be a very DMC municipal heavy talk from now. Okay, so the Delhi Municipal Committee, or Delhi Municipality, as I refer to it interchangeably, it was formed in 1863 at a time when, after the Great Rebellion in 1857, there was this need for order and security in the cities. So it's that kind of context in which it was formed. Local elites who had sided with the colonial regime, so essentially those who were loyal, were given the opportunity to become municipal officials, along with European members, and carry out improvement projects in the city. So particularly the removal of sanitary nuisances, including unauthorized building construction. Right? And I'll talk about municipal officials in just a moment. But the idea behind a civic agency responsible for urban development in Delhi was, of course, influenced by metropolitan ideals. There were civic agencies in Europe as well, but an Indian municipality they possess powers to affect sanitation, conservancy, and maintain order on public streets more generally. Municipal policies were therefore predicated on European cultural norms that saw public and private as separate domains. So at this point, we have this notion of what is public space, which is being maintained in the interests of the public, and private space. So this distinction comes into force at this time. And there's interesting studies by Will Grover and others who talked about how people use this the notion of the public and so on. So the colonial context, however, in India, for example, it differed from the metropolitan one in the way municipal governance in the cities functioned, and historians have talked about this. For example, public nuisance laws in Indian cities, if there were public nuisance laws in Britain and in Indian cities, the Indian cities, they covered a wider range or a larger range of urban activities and behavior, which were not recognized as nuisances in England. So there was a difference here, or the rule of colonial difference, which meant that much more or many more activities rather were recognized as nuisances in India and not so in England. So the thrust of these nuisance laws, as they were called, were geared towards the regulation of Indian cultural habits, which were designated as degenerate, threatening, and confounding distinctions between public and private in the city. So, as I mentioned earlier, it was after the rebellion that municipalities were established, and interestingly, this was done by the extension of the Police Act of 1861. And as scholars have pointed out, it was actually policing that took, for a large portion of time, took 1/3 of municipal revenues in India. So quite a huge amount was spent on policing. Okay. I just, there's a picture of British and Indian municipal members, again, standing in for the DMC's logo, which I don't have, but this is from 1899. And as you can see, there are European and Indian members, and this is slightly when government takes place, but still representative from the time. Okay, one area where municipal intervention, or one area of municipal intervention rather, was the regulation of what were building encroachments in the city. Building additions such as plinths, balconies, and overhangings could be threatening to the rational and systematic ordering of spaces. And so colonial officials believed that they were encroaching upon public land. So there was a big issue with the regulation of these so-called encroachments. In Delhi, the construction and use of chabutras, masonry and wooden platforms, and many of us know about these chabutras. You've seen them, in town cities across India. These came under the scrutiny of the municipality in a big way. And I've actually looked at a lot of the municipal reports in the town hall, and the town hall, there's an archive in the basement, there was, and also in a different building, and also and there are reports about the regulation of tributaries, for example, which I found really interesting. So I'll be talking about this for this in this section. So these Shabutras, are platforms, as you know, extend from the house or shop frontage onto the streets, and they vary in size and design. They could be portable, as in the door of a shop, for example, could be used as a Chabutra. And these Chabutras also had various uses. So they could be used to recline or be leased out to peddlers or small traders to sell their wares. So you create a Chabutra and then use it outside the shop. In short, there wasn't a particular way of actually constructing a Chabutra or using a Chabutra. And this flexibility was later used to evade municipal laws or regulations if the opportunity arose. I'll just talk about that in a bit. And there is an interesting report from the 1890s that documents how troublesome the presence and construction of these tributaries was for the municipalities. The municipalities, as I said, this came under the purview, and they were quite incensed about this. I'll read this section out. It's actually from an 1890 report, and it's a very longest quotation. I put it up, but it's quite relevant to actually discuss this. So, evidence, as the report says, the municipal report says, evidence of such encroachments is forthcoming in almost all bazaars of the city, this is Delhi, to a careful old observant and to the most idle eye in the suburban wards of our town, and almost all the towns of the Delhi division. The usual way of additions and encroachment is by allowing a little rubble, malva, outside the shop, and then adding a few stones to it, evidently as a footstep or for going and coming out of the shop. Then on some rainy day to make it into the form of a chabutra as wide as the breadth of the lane would permit. And then by permission or otherwise, on the pretext of repairing, turn the existing chabutra into a pakka one, and then to protect the chabutra by a thatch, and then to make the pakka slanting cover or to enclose the chabutra into the shop itself. And finally, to add a new chabutra the same way as before till they render the large and wide streets narrow enough for car traffic. So obviously, this is a report that is quite incensed, as I mentioned, with how the chabutra is being added, how it's being developed, and whether and how it's actually rendering this wide street narrow, right? So this is a big problem for the municipality. So not surprisingly, the regulation of these structures would produce confrontations between the municipality and different sections of the population from time to time. Yet, the municipal interventions in the case of the Chabutra are also salient for other reasons. The archival evidence that we have reveals how the contradictions of urban policies could scupper municipal plans, but also alongside these problems or these failures, the municipality was able to bolster its powers with an increasingly sophisticated array of regulations and bylaws. So to combat the profusion of these unregulated extensions of the Chabutra, the municipality first used the nuisance laws under the Police Act of 1861, which I mentioned earlier. So under Section 5 of the Police Act, the municipality was given a wider range of power to create bylaws and levy fines for any encroachment. And what we see is quite early on, so in 1864 itself, right? So they issue an order, a really sweeping order. They say in 1864 that all Chabutras, right, all Chabutras on public thoroughfares, irrespective of their age. So it doesn't matter how old they were, when they were constructed, all of them in 1864, in March 1864, were earmarked for demolition in Delhi. Now, you can imagine that this, if all such Chabutras earmarked for demolition would cause cry. And we find that the orders passed in 1864 are rescinded in 1866 to allow the construction of new Chabutras, quote, erecting, altering, and repairing them, but only with municipal approval in every case. So the issue of the age of the Chabutra had been dropped in this new set of regulations. We see that the municipality reiterates this new policy in relation to the sale of public land. So this is what the municipality stated. It's the opinion of the commissioners that all chabutras erected on shop fronts by the sides of the streets of the city that are built on land belonging to the public and that occupiers have no right to them. This is the interesting thing. Having, however, had the possession of these chabutras for many years, occupiers of the shops may be permitted to use them, but that they have no right whatever to sell the chabutras or the land on which they stand. Because of the fragmentary nature of these municipal records, it's difficult to conclude exactly why this decision was overturned within 2 years. So 64 they went ahead and 66 they went back. But the dropping of the age of the chabutra is quite telling in this matter. And it's perhaps this factor that caused tension between chabutra users and the municipality. With a wide range of chabutras constructed at different times, it was perhaps considered easier to regulate their spread and construction, and therefore the new decision or direction, instead of becoming entangled in legal disputes over the antiquity or proprietorship of land that may have originated. So such issues sparked a scramble then to find effective laws for the regulation of urban encroachments. So by the 1880s, municipalities such as in Delhi were endowed with a sophisticated set of laws through acts like the Municipal Act of 1884 or the Municipal Act of Punjab, as it was known. And it gave courts the punishment of all offences partaking the character of public nuisances, which were not otherwise provided by laws. It gave the municipality a huge amount of powers and bylaws, allowed the ability to create bylaws. Now, what I should clarify that I'm not saying that there is a simplistic case here between the failure of the municipality or municipalities and the growth of such laws. So what I want to suggest is that the search for effective laws became an exercise and a word unto itself, right? And created new possibilities for the municipality estate, but it took it into different directions from their originally stated intentions. So there is no necessary correlation between the enlargement of municipal powers and the efficacy of municipal work. So it did not somehow set municipalities on the right track, right? So this whole range of municipal bylaws did not necessarily turn things around for the municipality, right? But it led it into different directions. Quite opposite seems to be the case. So actually with these new bylaws, there were more problems. So the production of detailed safeguards, voluminous and detailed safeguards, created more liabilities for municipalities. One example is the ambiguity of legal terms that came with the creation of new acts and procedures. So under a subset of the Punjab Act of 1884, as it was known, there was a clause listed for compensation of chabutras if they were legally in existence at the time of the passing of the act. But this idea that lawfully in existence was a term used. The idea this term lawfully in existence was ambiguous. And this ambiguity caused problems in municipal work in Delhi, for example. In 1892, there was a leading member of the municipality called Gildari Lal. Gildari Lal was, he wrote a report that the civil courts were barring the claims of the municipality, costing it a huge amount in compensation. It's worth quoting his statements. So he says, Gildari Lal says, now surely the word, this word he's talked about, lawfully in existence means, in my opinion, not the described existence of the chabutra unless it has been in existence for the last 60 years, so as to bar the claim of the government. But some lawfully existing ones are such as by license, purchase, etc., and the interpretation put on them by our court is, I'm sorry, against the apparent meaning. And in many cases, the committee has lost, as he's talking about, the DMC has lost the point if the plaintiff has proved its existence, proved the existence of the chabutra for the last 12 years. So he's actually complaining about these laws and the fact that they cause more trouble in terms of compensation that the municipality has to pay out. Robert Clark, who at the time in 1892 was the deputy commissioner of the city, and he was Gildari Lal's superior. He also echoed the helplessness of the situation at the time. So Robert Clark, who's his superior, as I mentioned, says the municipality of Delhi had been most unfortunate in such cases where they had appeared before the civil courts, either as plaintiffs or defendants. He felt that it was useless for the Delhi municipality to try and prevent encroachments, so he didn't mention that. So when the question of lawful existence was certain to be decided against the Delhi municipality. And when, quote, fabulous sums are awarded against them when reasonable compensation has got to be settled by the courts. So the removal of these chabutras was proving to be very costly for the municipality. Even when municipal authorities had earmarked chabutras for demolition, the ambiguous nature of legal terms could be used by enterprising individuals rather, to claim a substantial amount of compensation in court. Moreover, the expenses of having cases appealed to the chief court, which was in Lahore, not the district, but the chief court in Lahore, often tempted municipal officials in Delhi to settle payments rather than avoid further losses. So they found that it was better to actually settle payments to compensate rather than actually head to the chief court in Lahore, which they felt would have decided against their claims. So if the failure of municipal enterprise in this matter spawned a new world of acts and legislations, this itself had the potential of subverting municipal operations, increasing its legal entanglements and the disbursement of compensation claims. It was always preferable to settle disputes in Delhi rather than have the cases appealed to Lahore. They're quite frightened of it going to the chief court in Lahore, as I mentioned. So we see a process here. The municipal failure, there is municipal failure, but there is the expansion of its regulatory powers. But yet, this is not leading to some cure for in terms of these urban issues that they're handling, right? So it isn't setting them on the right track, despite all these laws. So the next thing I want to talk about is sanitary surveillance and municipal bureaucracy. So the administrative structure of the municipality. So another area where we see, I don't have, so I've got this image of a municipal, the MCD's municipal speaker here. This is from the Hindustan Times. This is a contemporary image. I don't have one. I'll be talking about sweepers and administration municipalities. But I do not have an image of the sweeper at the time. But just before I do, I just want to talk a little bit about the administrative structure more generally. So one of the ways in which the municipality's administrative structure worked and was supposed to work was to help it with regard to sanitary surveillance. Some historians suggested that censuses, registration practices, mapping and surveying in India were tools in the civilizing mission. They were meant, so these practices of registration mapping, they weren't just objective, they were meant to isolate, classify, and discipline, and ultimately assert the irreducible difference of the native body. So that's what they're arguing, is that the tools allow they are tools in civilizing mission. They allow the assertion of colonial power by asserting the difference of the native body. Yet to police public spaces, as the municipality was doing, they had to walk the streets. What do I mean by that? Is that the surveillance, the generation of facts and figures and reports was an expensive and labor-intensive process that required manpower to patrol the spaces in the city. And historian Gyan Prakash has stated that the need for enumerating and surveying the native population's economic, its epidemiological and demographic properties, it, quote, set into motion a powerful process of bureaucratic expansion in an effort to centralize power. Municipalities also had a hierarchy of personnel ranging from the elite Indian ward member, the European ward members, but also the Indian ward members, and all the way down to the sweepers who were co-opted by the municipality, forcefully in many cases, to report on sanitary nuisances and building encroachments. So they had this hierarchical structure that they were using to police streets in terms of sanitary nuisances and building encroachments. But extending bureaucratic involvement did not end the problem of policing sanitary or other encroachments of the municipality. Ironically, this resulted in the very opposite. And in the case of the regulation of encroachments, the municipality's admin organization provides an understanding of the ways in which bureaucratic enlargement, failure, and the reproduction of state power was intimately linked with one another. So I'll talk through some of the ways in which they did that now. So In 1871, municipal proposals paved the way for the division of the city. So this is, I'm talking about, when I say city, I'm talking about Shahjahanabad, which is today referred to as Old Delhi. Municipal proposals paved the way for the division of Shahjahanabad, Old Delhi, to be divided, to the division of the city and its suburbs into wards. They were called ilakas. Each ilaka was under a subcommittee of members with the responsibility of undertaking, quote, investigations, inspections, or questions of law in the ilaka. This was known by the municipality, or known to the municipality, as the ilaka system, as they refer to it in municipal reports. It was an expansion of municipal administration based on this notion that constant surveillance of the streets would reduce the persistent encroachment and sanitary nuisances in Delhi. With one municipal member and 5 assistants, this is how it works. So it was one municipal member and 5 assistants. They visited each ward under their assignment at least once a week, right? And then they reported any transgressions at municipal meetings. So that was what they wanted to do. And then these transgressions were reported in municipal meetings, and the ilaka system was therefore a simple yet efficient municipal proposal for the city to survey and to check encroachments and so on. These new arrangements were moreover superimposed upon existing measures, which included the recruitment of mohalla sweepers for sanitary purposes and policing by the municipality, right? Sweepers or jamadars, they were used by the municipality to collect registration statistics, that is, the account of births and deaths, along with performing their usual duties like the collection of disposal of refuse from privies outside. And they were co-opted by the municipality into this system, right? This ilaka system. Historians have suggested that these sweepers achieved police status, as well as visibility and legitimacy in official eyes, because what they could do was they could, because of their admission into households and their familiarity with the neighborhoods. So, Jyoti Sagar, for example, who also works on Delhi, she's talked about how these sweepers went inside houses and they were able to get registration statistics, deaths, births, and so on. And they were used as a proxy by colonial authorities to actually get into Indian households and Indian cities like Delhi, because direct municipal intervention would be an intrusion, and this was a better, more efficient way, an effective way for them to do so. And in time, it became commonplace for information on a wide variety of matters, including neighborhood building construction and sanitary nuisances on the streets, to be reported as part of the sweeper's duty. So the ward sweeper, the sweeper would go on and report whatever construction or nuisances, as they called it, alongside cleaning the street or cleaning the privies. So ilaka members and their army of local staff and sweepers became this hierarchical structure of the municipal administration, created with the intention of regulating the urban domain, right? Reporting sanitary and other building encroachments, so in all cases, this could be visible to official eyes. Now, as I mentioned earlier, rather than a boon for the municipality, similarly in this case, these procedures created a new set of problems. The reorganization of municipal bureaucracy meant that ward policing became reliant upon, in the words of an Indian official, as he stated, quote, the honesty of the ward jamadar and the loyalty to the committee's policy, which the ward member is prepared to exhibit. So in many cases, sanitary nuisances or encroachments went unreported or were overlooked, providing opportunities for the subversion of municipal plans. If residents of the city could cultivate ties with ilaka representatives and staff, there was a chance that sanitary violations could be overlooked and building applications pushed forward for approval. And there's repeated evidence of this in municipal records. The chaos caused by a flood of applications being recommended by ward members for building additions is one. So you have people who use the ward member, the ilaka member, who comes in and is actually, instead of policing this, when you apply for permission and for building additions and so on, and he recommends it. So he said, well, I'm pushing this forward, and you should get it. And the municipality is inundated with all these flood of requests for building additions. We hear of hasty notices issued to ward members saying that, quote, they should pay due attention to the bylaws and recommend applications as are absolutely necessary and cause no obstruction. So quite a stern message. But we get this, and through this we can extrapolate and say that this is going going on in the wards. Significantly, I should say that many of these problems are not because of some inherent corruptibility of Indian officials, and I don't want to. I mean, and while issuing such racialist culturalist assumptions, we need to think about how these problems are actually a product of municipal policies and the inequities of colonial rule. Right? I don't subscribe to these assumptions. So I just wanted to talk about this a little more. So hang on, we'll go back to this one right now. So in Delhi, for example, if these sweepers were exploited really heavily, so they were really exploited, paid very little for the labor, and actually blamed for lapses in their wards. So the sweepers would get the brunt of it if something was out of order. In Delhi, if there were arrears in the payment of rent for any use of municipal land or services, it's the sweepers of the wards that were forced to pay the amount from their own pockets, right? So if somebody who had violated bylaws, building construction bylaws, it was a sweeper actually that was paying for the violation of laws, because presumably the sweeper had failed to check that, but that's the allegation that they would be paying. Added to this was the fact that they were paid extremely poorly. I mentioned that. A sweeper in Delhi in the 1890s could make more money as a manual laborer instead of working for the municipality. This, plus the threat of instant dismissal and the limited opportunities for promotion, made it impossible to retain sweepers for a substantial period of time. And because of this, till the 1880s, the sweepers in Delhi resisted being formally employed as municipal servants. In light of such harsh working conditions and outright exploitation, they were willing to receive money from other sources or perhaps turn a blind eye when it came to reporting sanitary or building encroachments. Now, if sweepers were at the bottom of the municipal hierarchy, those at the other end of the spectrum, which is the ward members, the Indian ward members, or after what was called the local self-government scheme, which was introduced in India in 1882, who were those elected representatives, they were also willing to overlook encroachments and other transgressions. For elected representatives, for example, maintaining cordial relationships with wealthy merchants or shopkeepers was a way of securing votes at municipal elections. With the extension of the municipal franchise in the 1880s, wealthy elites like bankers and shopkeepers were able to vote and have a stake, albeit limited, in municipal government. And to be elected as a ward member meant that one had to grant concessions from time to time to and allied any encroachments, or in order to have the backing of local magnates. So we see evidence of this from the 1890s when colonial officials in Delhi write to their superiors in the government of Punjab and suggest that while ward members were not neglectful of the duties in Delhi, since their position depended upon the votes of the residents, members had, quote, a distinct incentive to wink at conveniences to themselves secured by his constituents at the expense of the public. So the extension of municipal power had the effect of subverting its own intentions once again. Thus, Girdhari Lal, the official that we referred to earlier, he's here in that report of his, gives us the most unambiguous picture of such problems of bureaucratic reorganization in 1892. In his report, he writes, it is, quote, very easy to win the low-paid Jamadar, the sweeper, to his side for a wealthy shopkeeper. And on the other hand, the ward member himself, quote, whose very existence depended upon the votes of these individuals, did sometimes connive in the matter. So he's admitting this. However, a mere acknowledgement of the situation did not mean that somehow this faith in municipal enterprise or its structural limitations was challenged. Rather, the cure for an inefficient bureaucracy came in the form of more bureaucratic reorganization. Stronger regulations were perceived to be the remedy for ineffectual local procedures, and this is what was happening. In the case of encroachments, for example, Girdhari Lal, remember, he said that a new map of the town was needed to record the dimensions of all the buildings and streets as they then stood, so the municipality would have a better chance of challenging encroachments in the future. This, he felt, needed a responsible official who would go around getting signatures of the owners of the houses, recording the state of their buildings in the presence of other witnesses, two other witnesses, he said, who were known to the municipality. So this is what he's recommending. He's saying we need a responsible member who should now go on, get signatures. So he's asking for some sort of reorganization. Yeah. He says he should have two other witnesses who were known to the municipality. And now these guys this recommendation is premised on a reorganization of the current administrative methods and obviously the LACA system, and creates a new form of bureaucratic involvement. In detailed surveys and maps, it was thought that it was a solution to creating a more effective administration and an end to sanitary problems and building regulations. So these were the contradictions that lay at the core of this municipal bureaucratic expansion, and it was believed through constant reorganization and restructuring could effective measures be implemented and problems solved. Indeed, these recommendations, as I said earlier as well, were part of a process, right, that enlarged the powers of the bureaucracy further and simultaneously stifled its prospects of policing and surveillance. Now, the last example that I want to take to talk about this municipal enterprise is technical expertise. So I'm going to talk about water and drainage now. And of course, it's all very topical, water drainage in Delhi and infrastructure projects. So and there's some resonance there in terms of what I'm going to talk about. So in terms of water infrastructure projects, technology infrastructure, Colonial claims of superiority or civilization superiority often rested on the possession of this technology, of technical expertise and scientific expertise. Obviously, these were touted as the fruits of the civilizing mission, right? And as experts in their field, there were sanitary commissioners, there were inspectors who were involved in a supervisory capacity to municipalities in Delhi, in India. And these inspectors and sanitary commissioners, they possessed a vast executive powers and responsibilities, unlike it was in Britain. So what I'm trying to suggest is that there were obviously inspectors, sanitary inspectors and commissioners in Britain and in India. The difference was that their authority in India, their executive powers that they had was much, much greater, right? So there's again this notion of how it is different from the metropolis in that sense. Now, contrary to claims that a ready expertise and growing body of colonial knowledge would benefit municipal work, a profusion of opinions and recommendations from such experts often impaired municipal operations. As the scale and complexity of proposals and recommendations grew, what we find is that cash-strapped municipalities found themselves failing to carry out even the most basic tasks in the city. Yet again, in the production of such failures, municipalities were fed constantly. How? In this case, as I show, their aptitude for planning increased considerably. So I'm going to talk about how these municipalities, failed, of course, in terms of how they were cash-strapped and they couldn't perform their tasks. But there was something happening alongside that, which is that their aptitude for planning and the reorganization again of the municipality was taking place side by side, right, despite these problems that it was having. So, I'm just going to talk about drainage now. I have a slide here of a Mughal rainwater drain. This is from the Hindustan Times. I actually wanted to talk, this is a rainwater drain, but I wanted to talk about Mughal underground drains, Shahjahani drains. I haven't found a picture of the Shahjahani drain, so this stands in its place. But the Lahori bricks, as you can see here, would probably have been the same sort of system of obviously different for underground drains, but the Lahori bricks would have been used. But we can talk about this in the discussion. I'm sure somebody would have more knowledge about this. But just to stand in for a Shahjahani drain. Before British rule in Delhi under the Mughals, Delhi had an extensive network of underground drains that ran across the city in a crisscross manner. As the road level of the city rose, the drains became quite a long way below the surface. Drain cleaning in Delhi was always a difficult affair. And this remained so in the early 19th century, even under the East India Company that was there before. The rebellion, it controlled the city from 1803 to 57. it was a problem under that too. So they also had a lot of problems cleaning the drains. Now, after the establishment of the municipality in 1863, it followed a similar policy as its pre-mutiny predecessor, pre-rebellion predecessor, and drain cleaning was sporadic, much to the anger of local residents. So why was this so, right? So why does it follow? Why is this drain cleaning very sporadic? Why does it anger people so much? To understand the neglect of the city's drains, we need to consider the often contradictory nature of colonial expertise and policy. In Delhi, if the repair of old Mughal drains was patchy, the Delhi municipality in 1871, it enthusiastically began constructing a new network of underground drains between 1871 and 73, with the intent of giving the cities a cleanly appearance. However, as these drains were completed, the municipality's work was criticized by senior officials. They were criticized by sanitary experts as being unsuitable. So Delhi municipality sets these new underground drains. It starts making them between 1871 and 73. Instead of, they have a problem, as I mentioned, with cleaning the Shahdani drains, but they start making other drains to give it a cleanly appearance, as they say. But they are, they are criticized, they're castigated by the sanitary experts that as being unsuitable. So the then sanitary commissioner under the government for Punjab, for example, he criticizes the drainage work and he points out that the new network that Delhi municipality is constructing is in a haphazard manner, quote, on no definite principle, and significantly, this is not done on competent advice. So he completely lambasts the municipality and says this is rubbish. This sort of criticism that he gives out, it sheds some light on the ambiguity surrounding notions of correct procedure and is evidence of perhaps competing sanitary models or recommendations and how they clash in local contexts. The municipality had hired public works departments, so there was the PWD engineers to help them with drainage construction and maintenance. However, these engineers were often at the center of controversies and stopped from conducting their responsibility by the sanitary officials in the light of new research or professional opinion, as in the case of the drains that they constructed. So this engineer would have gone in and constructed these drains, and this this sanitary specialist, this sanitary expert, comes in and says, actually, this is quite rubbish, so don't do that. And there was confusion often in terms of what was to be implemented, how this would take place. And in many cases, the construction of this new set of technology was a process of moving one step forward and two steps back. By the late 1870s, this question of drainage took a new turn. Sanitary commissioners began recommending the creation of surface or gutter drains that were supposedly better than any underground drainage system in India. These new surface drains were not only promoted as resting on sound scientific basis, so obviously this is something that is, as I said, constantly touted, but it was also cost effective, right? A cheap alternative for the continuous cleaning, repair, and construction of the older underground drains, right? So you have experts coming in and saying, actually, you know what, we have sophisticated technology, it's also cheaper to install, and it's better than cleaning those old underground drains. And what this meant now in practice was that the municipality, like in Delhi, had to freeze the construction of the underground drains they were building, but also the repair of older Mughal drains until the government sanctioned a comprehensive drainage plan on how surface drainage was to be conducted. So they started saying, okay, well, if there are recommendations that this is cheaper, this is more effective, then let's wait for them to give us a proposal. And then we'll create this. So stop what you're doing right now because it's more expensive to keep spending money on this. So just wait. In other words, so local engineers and the municipality who they worked with often awaited instructions from experts on new plans in light of their criticism of prevailing practices. And in 1880, we have the snippet I'll read out. The local engineer of the PWD, who was employed by the Delhi municipality, recommended and said that the repair and maintenance of drains be halted. He feared that any expenditure and effort would be defeated by a drainage scheme which he felt was in the offing. And a note written by the municipality goes on to suggest that, quote, it is impossible to proceed with the service drainage of lanes in Pucha since the work was complicated, and its engineer pointed out that, quote, the whole work would have to be done all over again when the drainage scheme came out. Had this not been the case, the engineer says that he would have proceeded to level and pave the drains of all minor streets. Okay, so now this drainage fiasco becomes even more complicated with the growth of medical discourse, medical theories, and sanitary discourses, particularly as the demand for drainage facilities begin to intersect with water supply of the city. So we have this all this while I've been talking about the drainage of the city. And now you have a question of water, right? And the relationship between the two. It's at this time that the government authorities begin considering whether both the drainage and water supply could be initiated together in a comprehensive plan for water and drainage. The need for a water supply scheme wasn't an entirely new development. It was considered separately in the 1860s. Scientific experts working alongside the Delhi municipality had classified the water in the wells of the city as bad, on sanitary grounds. So they had said the water in the wells is khara pani, bad, is on sanitary grounds, it shouldn't be had. And what was a motivating factor was the health of the colonial troops. So if they were going to drink that, then the emanations from the city filth, they said, had infiltrated the water and caused the infections made visible by the presence of boils on the bodies of soldiers stationed at the Lal Killa, or the Red Fort, which was formerly the Mughal palace. Right. So they said that this water was bad. These people have boils. Obviously, it's affecting the army. That's a major issue. So, you need a water supply in the 1860s. The remedy for such ills was prescribed by bringing piped water from the Yamuna outside the city. So the idea was that we bring piped water inside the city and we get rid of these problems. And the story Abhendra Sharan has shown how these debates over piped water were rooted in a politics of difference. He says that narratives of pollution guided the preference of a new scheme of water supply and the use of traditional sources of water, which were ignored by the colonial government in Delhi. Yet in the 1860s, this dream of piped water remained a pipe dream because the government of India deemed investment in water supply too costly at the time. So although this debate was going on in the 1860s, the government of India said, no, hang on a second, well, it's too expensive. Stop. So there's too expensive. So what happens then by the 1880s? However, by the 1880s, the situation changes. If a water supply scheme had been held back on account of finances earlier, now the influence in medical theories on malaria or malarial fever suggested that water supply and drainage had to be combined together to alleviate sanitation problems in cities. So you have this notion that you have to combine both water supply and drainage together. So in the 1860s, again, I'll just repeat that it was water supply was like, yeah, good, but too expensive. But by the 1880s, now you're thinking, well, actually, you have to have some sort of system to do them both together. While the demand for pure river water was always a cause championed by visionaries and municipalities, in the 1870s, sanitary discourses, colonial discourses, they began to associate excess water in native environments with debilitating health problems and disease. The knowledge base came from those officers who were working in the villages irrigated by the Ganga Yamuna Canal in the Delhi district. And so they made a connection between irrigated tracts, well-irrigated tracts, and spleen disease. So there was this work going on in the 1870s where officials were talking about how to get spleen disease and irrigation, well-irrigated tracts, and spleen disease. So they were trying to make a connection. And what they said was that excess salinity of the soil and oversaturation of the soil and seepages from colonial water supplies were beginning to be suspected as the cause for malariousness, right? So this is before the germ theory, and then you get malaria, that malarial miasmas are the cause that the soil has something to do with it, the water in the soil. So by 1879, the Sanitary Commission of the Army, so that was early in the 1870s. Now this is by 1879. The Sanitary Commission of the Army was formally declaring that excess water would lead to an increase in mortality rates and the drainage of cities like Delhi and its suburbs had to, quote, proceed pari passu with the water supply. In a damning indictment, his report suggested that if this was not followed, more water would lead to more epidemic mortality. And the health of the troops is, of course, a big factor in this, because the Sanitary Commission of the Army and the troops were residing in Delhi at the time. So more water would mean more epidemic mortality. So drainage and water supply had to proceed together, right? So now you see what's happening by the 1880s is that the fortunes of water supply and drainage, which was the issue earlier, are being tied together. However, what happens when these two things are tied together is that this entails a rethinking of project costs and practicability for municipalities such as the Delhi municipality. So the Delhi municipality is alive to the need of creating a comprehensive project, but it's also wary that the proposed expenditures have to be scaled down if the government, the superiors, the government of Punjab, were to sanction both schemes simultaneously. And as I'm going to talk a little bit about costs and project costs now. So we have a clear sense of this in the address to municipal members in 1882 by the vice president of the municipality, who's talking about how professional opinions had influenced the decision to create an integrated plan of water supply and drainage, and the need to ensure that the scheme would not cost too much on its own. This is what he's saying. As the project for drainage of the city bears so close a relation to that for the water supply, that we have professional opinions in carrying both projects out together. So again, he's admitting now this is that they have to do it together. Under these circumstances, the financial aspect of the drainage scheme and its main features must be borne in mind considering the present scheme. The revised drainage project is approaching the completion of the able hands of Mr. Morley, who is the engineer, and will be brought up for consideration in a few years. This is in 1982. He's talking about this in terms of the integration of the two schemes. So accounts like this are also revealing because in as much as they give a sense of our experts like, this man Morley, Mr. Morley, are continuing to be used to municipal work, they are hired with the intention of creating cost-effective plans for the municipality. However, and quite predictably in the colonial context, when revised plans are actually created by people like Morley, and they're sent to higher authorities like the government of Punjab, the outlay involved, the expenditure involved is considered too much. So in 1882, for example, the Delhi municipality proposed to borrow an amount of 12 lakhs and 50,000 in the open market. So it says, hang on a second, we'll borrow this in the open market, and it requested a contribution of 2 lakhs 50,000 from the government. So it says we'll borrow 12 lakhs 50,000 in the open market, but give us 2 lakhs 50,000 from the government, and this is refused. So the government of Punjab says no. And this was the second time, this is refused by the government in Calcutta, the imperial government in Calcutta. So there's a Punjab government, there's a Delhi government in Delhi, the municipality, and then there is Calcutta. So the government in Calcutta refuses to help the municipality in their plans for the creation of water supply and drainage projects. Second time, it's refused in 1882. The refusal, what does it do? Well, the refusal means that they have to redraft the plans. So the reason is given that it's too expensive. Even 2 lakhs 50,000 from the government is too expensive. Can't it be cheaper? Okay, the refusal means that they have plans have to be redrafted again, and the municipality worked out a scheme that was affordable and thus acceptable. In this process, resources and manpower are being devoted to this endeavor in the hope for the solution to the city's water and drainage problems. As I mentioned earlier, along with the hunt for improved drainage and water supply, there is a hunt for personnel who could draft such scientific and cost-effective plans for the municipality. So by 1905-6, we hear that the Delhi municipality, despite the want of funds to carry out schemes, it expands its establishment by employing a permanent engineer, a man called T. Solkield, who is chosen, quote, under expert opinion out of 34 candidates, right? So they actually recruit a guy, an expert, to try and help them develop this scheme, as a permanent expert attached to the municipality, despite not having this scheme. Or trying to redraft and figure out something that is cheaper for it to be authorized. And interestingly, so here's I've got an advertisement in this journal called the Surveyor and Municipal County Engineer for a permanent assistant engineer in 1912. So what's happening is that the municipal establishment is expanding further, right? This guy Solki, interestingly, is the one attached to it, and he is the one who's recruiting for the an assistant later. And in 1911, he wins the medal or the Bar Medal in 1911 for useful services rendered to His Majesty in his Indian Empire for the advancement of public interest. Right, he gets it for sanitation purposes. But essentially, his job is to devise plans that will hopefully be affected or implemented by the municipality once they're approved by the government of India. This is what he's doing. So again, I think it's very interesting that the establishment is expanding, but the plan isn't as yet it doesn't really fall apart. So if this was the direction in which the municipality was devoting its energies, there was still an unwillingness of higher authorities to sanction funds for the water and drainage schemes, and this stalled any hopes of progression and implementation. So in 1886, when funds are asked by the municipality, so again, and they're even agreed by the provincial government. So it's first asked, they ask Punjab, and Punjab agrees, and the government, Calcutta, the imperial government, refuses to sanction the amount. So again, back to the drawing board. But what's going on? Meanwhile, the threat of sickness and disease in the city forces the municipality to start carrying out selective cleaning of the Shahjani drains. So while these plans are being drafted, the engineers are being hired, and and the establishment is increasing, people are complaining. And the municipality decides, okay, hang on a second, we should clean this. We should get our act together. We should clean some of the old drains from time to time. In contravention to government directives, some drains were also constructed, but even this policy is scaled back, and the municipality considered it unwise, except, quote, in special cases, to go on making drains which might not fit in with the general project. Thus, the hope remained that the government would soon sanction the money for both water supply and drainage works, and they would be underway in the city. Right, so they're just waiting. The limited stuff that it does, then they backtrack and say, maybe we shouldn't do that, because when a new scheme comes up, we have to do it all over again, right? So let's not spend money right now. So there is a lot of criticism in the local papers, and I've kind of plucked out some of this at this time. The tardiness and piecemeal manner of the municipality. So obviously the municipality is in the crossfire right now. It's the one that's, people are talking about the fact that it is ineffective. It is unable to. It is incompetent. It's unable to do what it sets out to do. And they receive criticism in local newspapers. The Safi Hindi, Urdu newspaper, for example, it derided the municipality for the proposed increases in taxation on account of the water supply scheme, which it felt authorities were beginning to prioritize ahead of the drainage facilities. The municipality, it suggested, quote, should have taken steps to introduce an improved system of drainage before it thought of constructing the waterworks. So this is actually a very acute, and one could say an accurate diagnosis of the problem which the newspapers identified. But with drains clogged and the municipality unwilling to take further action, because scheme is about to come, right? That's what they think. Residents of the mohallas and kuchas took it upon themselves to find solutions to discard dirty water from their houses. In 1883, a Delhi correspondent of the Lahore newspaper, the Anjuman-e-Punjab, he suggests that this correspondent suggests that while the municipality had washed its hands of building and cleaning drains, scathing criticism, till the waterworks project was on its way, in certain quarters of the city, people started sinking earthen vessels into the ground in order to collect latrine dirty water, and then they started disposing it off by throwing it in the lanes. So people are resorting to throw out this water to check and dispose of their drain water. Now, all this is deeply ironic, right? Because the municipality had been trying to check nuisances on the streets for some time, but now because of its own policies, these residents are taking matters into their own hands. They're throwing, they perhaps are exacerbating nuisances, right? They're throwing water into the streets. So they're doing this despite the municipalities doing this, checking nuisances and so on. So this is actually increasing. So what I'm trying to say is that the growth of and the growing complexity, rather, of sanitary discourse and medical discourses leads to a situation where the municipality's own intentions to check these nuisances are undermined. And so to put this in another way, these medical theories, they lead to the creation of a large and complicated plan of municipal management. right? Which, because of insufficient funding, is then frozen in its tracks. And this leads to a cycle in which the Delhi municipality devises plans over and over, hoping that it will finally be passed and the fund would be sanctioned, and the water and drainage schemes would finally happen. And the municipality of the city, in anticipation of the constantly deferred schemes, they stop even the little that they were doing to resolve drainage issues, right? Individuals who were facing an overrun of dirty water had to invent solutions and threw the water into the lanes in a desperate effort to keep their lanes and neighborhoods clean. So what the municipality labeled as nuisances are increasing because people are now resorting to throwing this water outside. In the 1890s, what happens is, again, the government of India finally improves Delhi municipality's plans for the water and drainage schemes, but there are more financial problems. What happens is that with technical issues with the waterworks, so that they mean that more money is required than the original outlay. By 1897, I'm just going to give some figures, so please bear with me. By 1897, an amount of 10,40,000 had been spent on waterworks, and another 2 lakhs was required over and above the former amount. Money that was made available for the drainage scheme came in a piecemeal manner, and by 1899, the municipality still needed a sum of 6 lakhs just to complete the drainage of the area within the city walls. The drainage outside the city, the extramural drainage, as it was called, had been deferred until further notice. And the extramural drainage in the suburbs, what we call suburbs, they call suburbs rather, would have taken, and it took place at a much later date. So they'd been deferred until further notice. So with the sporadic construction, when the sporadic construction of drains did start to occur in the city, there was a bigger irony. What happened was that the creation of drains on a scientific basis created more friction with the residents, since building extensions like chabutras now had to be demolished in the notified zones that the drainage lines were passing through. It's quite interesting. So the zone in which these new drainage lines now have to go through, they're saying, well, we now have to demolish your chabutra. As we've seen, the dimensions of these chabutras were regulated in bylaws, and the municipality had avoided outright demolition since 1866. So once bitten, twice shy. They stopped in 1866. But by 1897, they once again found themselves in the process of demolishing chabutras, which were in the way of street extensions, which were in the way of these newly assigned works, and then again became embroiled in compensation disputes. So again, they have this problem where they have to go and figure out how to compensate people whose chabutras they're going to have to destroy. So in the name of progress and improvement, professionals and sanitary commissioners enthusiastically recommend the creation of waterworks and drainage technologies for the municipalities. However, the complexity, as I've been trying to say, the complexity of this technical expertise and sanitary discourses, they create problems for municipalities in as much as they increase the scale and expenses of the projects and lead to long waiting times in the hope that funds would be sanctioned by higher authorities. Proposals are drafted, redrafted, they go back and forth between officials who are unwilling to sanction the funds to municipal officials who are keen to harness superior technology. At a local level, the anticipation of forthcoming projects leads to the irregularity or stoppage of smaller operations, increasing as what were considered to be nuisances. And as I mentioned earlier, it further embroils the municipality in legal disputes with the residents of the mohallas and kuchas. Now, my point in raising the municipality's failures in this case has, of course, been to show how the complexity of expertise could stifle the operations in the city. But it should not obscure the unintended opportunities provided by these failed interventions. So in framing these detailed plans for approval, the municipality, as I mentioned, expands its bureaucratic responsibilities exponentially, right? Investigations, fact-checking, compilation of data, and the creation of a plan, a cost-effective plan, involve the allocation of resources, manpower, and expertise. And we've seen how this creation of a scientific yet cost-effective plan allowed for the recruitment of that gentleman, Mr. Morley, and a permanent increase in establishment with engineers like Solkey, right? So there are people who are being added to this establishment. So this added to municipal strength. This was an augmentation of bureaucratic responsibility and came despite its inability to convince higher authorities to fund its schemes. So all this planning thus took the municipality in different directions from its stated intentions and objectives. So it is creating an establishment, yet it is not being able to pin down and actually get a plan going for or approve going for a long time. So despite the ambiguity, contradictions, and resistance generated by them, the failure of municipal policy was not benign in this case, but it created a new way for the expansion of its powers. Okay, so I think we have some time for, just maybe 10 minutes just to 5 sentences to try and to talk, to conclude some of these things that I've talked about. Talked a lot about drains and costs of drains and water and encroachments and so on. So I think maybe I should try and get this back together. So by 1910, so if you were interviewing the municipality in 1910 before the shift of the capital in 1911, the municipality, the DMC could say to you, it had a large and hierarchical structure, and it possessed considerable powers of coercion endowed through municipal ordinances. So it could tell you that, yes, it has a hierarchical administration, there are people for different purposes, and it has considerable powers of coercion through these bylaws and these ordinances, right? It could boast, it had extensive maps of the city which were being designed. Sanitary surveys, it had registration records being kept, and that effective regulations were in place to check the creation of building, or regulations were in check to check the creation of sanitary and building encroachment. So it could say to you, it could say all this to you, right? In other words, the expansion of its own bureaucratic powers after 1863 were tremendous, right? So the growth of its powers were tremendous, yet the growth of municipal powers to reorder the city was a very chaotic, inconsistent, and irregular process. And as I've stressed, it was marked by a failure. So indeed, through the growing complexity of its operations, the costs and professional opinions, municipal policies and intentions were constantly being undermined even as this process sowed the seeds for its own longevity. So in carrying out its everyday affairs, the contradiction, there were contradictions, there was internal problems with different opinions, different agencies, different people clashing together, and there was external resistance, for example. All of this played its part in derailing the operations of the municipality. Yet municipal responses to overcome such a failure, sorry, let me just go back to the last slide. So, their responses to overcome such failure allowed the creation of these complex bylaws, the organization of bureaucracies, and the hire of engineers. It increased the establishment and reliance on expertise, which became commonplace. These did not, I do want to stress this again, these did not mean that municipal work somehow became more efficacious in the end, right? So, as I've said, there's no correlation between failure and the eventual success in municipal work. Failure took the municipality in new directions, and that's what I'm trying to really stress through this. The formation of investigative committees, the appointment of engineers, and the creation of plans all augmented the bureaucratic and regulatory powers, even as it failed to carry out those specific tasks that it actually undertook. So if one could say that the municipality, and as a historian has pointed out, that the municipality underdeveloped the city, it actually was able to add to its power and its image as an arbitrary and whimsical agent of the colonial government, right? So it did this while as it underdeveloped the city or in its failure. So this case that I presented, I hope, goes to show how the state grew in 19th century Delhi, right? I differ from the broader historiography because I don't think it's a story of order and stability that a new government brings after the rebellion of 1857, but I kind of see the opposite, right? And it is in that process, right, that there's an irony there. It's in fact in that process of disorder and failure that the seeds for the longevity of the state are sown. So, and I think we can identify, and I'd be happy to have a talk with everyone in the discussion. We can identify the legacies of such trends and processes even today, perhaps in Delhi. So I think, yeah, I think I've perhaps that's 50 minutes, it's slightly less than the 1 hour mark, but I hope that we'll, yeah, I can get into questions now, or Ishan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kishore, for that wonderful, extensive lecture. And it's more than 50 minutes, by the way. It's an hour and 20 minutes. But thank you so much for this wonderful, detailed lecture. I think it is important to understand because there is a relation between the past, the present, and the future. And when we talk about the urban planning, especially when New Delhi was being set up, it kind of takes with it this whole legacy of old Delhi and kind of making it with the new Delhi. So how do you see, because you were talking about this in the last part of your talk, that how these legacies are still relevant if we see the difference between old Delhi and new Delhi, and how the city is being governed right now under the present regime, both Delhi government and the Indian government. So how do you see the British legacy?
Yeah, so first I should apologize because I'm looking at my watch, and obviously I completely lost the track of time. So I do apologize to anybody who's thinking, oh, I should have finished in 1 hour. What's this guy doing? So sorry to everybody. So in terms of legacies, in your question, in terms of legacies, I do think that, if I go back to the case that I'm most familiar with in terms of the municipal the MCD now, I think that recently I wrote this in my book. There's the plans with the MCD, in terms of the recently, you must have heard. In fact, a couple of months ago, it was trifurcated in 2012, and about a month ago, it has been the MCD has been reorganized again into one agency. So it's become the MCD for all zones instead of having East Delhi, North Delhi, and so on in the division that it was trifurcated in 2012. I think there is a way in which these patterns are replicated, particularly in the way, I mean, those legacies, particularly with the municipality, I think are pretty telling in the way that it still carries on. For example, the exploitation, if you think about sanitation workers, etc., the pay, the strikes that happened in 2017, it was a case of of payment of these people who are possibly at the bottom rung, and they are and they went on strike. So the whole going on strike of municipal workers, particularly sanitation workers, has been a feature that you see in the colonial period too. And I think that, so in that way, sort of the way that it still thinks it picks on these workers to the exploitation of these workers, I think is a theme that is running there. And the other thing is that it relies on sanitation workers to do a lot of these tasks, which cleaning drains and so on, which has been an issue for a long time. So and I think that there's, like I said, the exploitation is something that is perhaps a colonial trend that it continues, and also in the way it thinks about imagining, the way the MCD thinks about how I think in the book I talked about how when the elections were going on a few years ago, there was an idea that that the government talked about, or the opposition, somebody talked about how we will reinvigorate or develop this into a world-class city by a reorganization of the municipality, because it needs to be reorganized. And funnily enough, it has been done right now, right? So it's been, instead of the trifurcation, now it's again being a single entity. So I think that this idea of enlargement, of reshaping it, the faith in this practice, rather than actually looking at the exploitative structural limitations or so on, that is something that continues.
A question that you also ask in some sense in your lecture and also in the book is, uh, were these failures, these confusions between the imperial government and the MCD, were they really productive at the end? Because it also gave rise to corruption of many senses, illegal encroachments in various parts, and claims by the residents of the old city. So how do you see that? What
Well, I
was
mean, as I mentioned, yeah. Sorry, go on.
what was the end result of these failures? And yeah.
Yeah, I think the end result of the failures, I think, was for, I mean, the part of the argument is that people who were enterprising were able to navigate these laws, right? So who negotiated them, and who were able to turn around and gain sums of compensation from the municipality. These were the guys who were enterprising and who could negotiate this stuff. But I think what I'm trying to say with the failure is that, in terms of the end result, what I say is that the establishment, right, the legal regulations, the bureaucracy, all of that is growing, right? So that's where I think that is very productive, right? So the agencies of the state, right, they're enlarging, right? So they are recreating themselves, they are reorganizing, and that is something that I see, is that the state expansion is happening, and that I think is quite productive, right? And there is another angle, which is that these people are able, they are successful in utilizing these ambiguities, these contradictions to their own advantage. So there's so many bylaws, and each one of them is, these guys, some of them will go and say, actually, this states here this and that, and which is contradictory to what you're saying. So why not just you're so then they threaten to take them to Lahore, and they say, well, actually, what, okay, let's deal with this here. So that's where I think we can think about how we can think about contradictions and success and so on. Yeah, failure.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Dr. Kishore. Right now, I do not see any questions in the chat, but those who are listening to us right now, who will be listening to us anytime, please feel free to share your questions on our email ID, which is caravanheritage@gmail.com. And we always share the questions with the speaker, and they get back to you on email. And you can also connect with the speaker later. He is quite active, not too active on Twitter. So please connect with Dr. Kishore. I think the username is at DOC Kishore. So if I'm not wrong, that's your Twitter ID.
Yeah, Doc R. Kishore. Yeah.
Doc R. Kishore. So please follow Doc R. Kishore on Twitter, and Karwan on YouTube, on Instagram, so that you can stay connected with what we do. We do all sorts of weird, crazy things with history of India and heritage that kind of makes history and heritage accessible to all of us. Thank you so much, Dr. Kishore, for taking out time to deliver this lecture. Truly an honor
Yeah.
to see you.
No, thanks for inviting me, and I'm truly sorry. I completely lost track of time. Otherwise, I would have kept it for like exactly an hour. But
So
I
I
kind of
think it was
spoke for
a
an hour.
treat. It was a treat listening to you. The book is
Thanks.
available with the publishers, Orient Black Swan. So those who wish to get the book, please write to the publishers, or even try Amazon if the book is available, The Ungovernable City. I am very sure you'll get to learn a lot about the making of a city, the making of policies that governs a city. So please do read. Please do share your reviews with us. We already mentioned our email ID, caravanheritage@gmail.com. If you want to support Caravan, our UPI ID is 955 922 at Paytm. Uh, you can donate, or you can support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel at, I think it's 85 rupees a month, which is lesser than a coffee. So do support. Thank you so much, and we'll meet again on 1st of July to have a lecture by Dr. Venkat Dhulipala on creating a new Medina, the creation of Pakistan, on 1st of July, 5 p.m. IST. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Kishore. We'll be in
Thanks a
touch.
lot. Thank you.